Hello and welcome to the Election Show on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. Joining me today via Zoom, as always, is Matt McDermott, Communications Strategist and Vice President of Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with us today is Political Analyst and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Great for another week.
With you again.
So let's just jump right in. We've had a busy week. Matt, I want to start with you. The president spoke to George Stephanopoulos this week in a town hall setting, something that the president has not done. We know that he's pretty much controlled his media narrative. He speaks to his press pool when he feels like it. He doesn't hold regular briefings, and he hasn't really been out in environments that aren't sort of friendly to him. So we know that he'll call into Fox News and he speaks very highly of OAN and the new sort of OAN network that he likes sometimes more than Fox, essentially their propaganda network for him. But he spoke to ABC's George Stephanopoulos. There's some mixed reviews. Fox News and the Trump administration said it was a hit job. Many people thought that the president was unprepared. He blamed Joe Biden quite a bit for everything from the coronavirus to California wildfires, mask wearing, you name it, it was all Joe Biden's fault. Walk us through sort of your analysis as a Democratic strategist as to what you saw when the president sat down with George Stephanopoulos this past week.
Yeah, I think we saw this week two things at play, both of which are frankly difficult for Trump's reelection and are aiding Joe Biden. The first is, to your point, Donald Trump did a town hall with George Stephanopoulos. Also this week, we saw Joe Biden do a town hall with CNN. And seeing those two side by side was frankly pretty striking. What I saw in that is a president of the United States who, to your point, just does not engage with the American people at regular intervals. I mean, he just seemed completely incapable of even engaging in conversation with everyday Americans who are struggling in this environment and have very honest and very real questions for their president about what he intends to do with the next 4 years of his presidency. It was just really striking to me, and I think it speaks to the ecosystem that the Trump presidency has lived in, where, to your point, he listens to Fox every day, he listens to OAN every day, he listens to his propaganda networks, he has sycophants around him who are yes men and tell him he's doing a great job. And then you see him in a situation where he has to actually go out and talk to people, and he's just completely flat-footed. He has no presentation of his next 4 years. He can speak to no accomplishments he's done. And it's just a perplexing situation for him because it doesn't actually feel like he's running a re-election campaign in some sense. It feels like he's just so stuck in that bubble of cult-like propaganda that he's not actually engaging with swing voters in a way that would actually win them their vote.
Right. I mean, you know, Lincoln, you've talked quite a bit about the fact that you were flummoxed and perplexed as to why the president refuses to try to expand his base. He literally just speaks to the people who worship him. He loves the rallies. That's essentially his lifeblood in many ways. And he only surrounds himself with people who give him praise and adulation. Do you think that this strategy, I mean, he's holding steady at 45%. There's still quite a few Americans that will not ever leave this president, whether because of the tax breaks or the children in cages. Either way, they support many of his initiatives. As failed as they may be, they still support them. This strategy of not expanding the base, but making sure that his base is rock solid and concrete, do you think that that's, and sprinkle in a little Russian interference and some sort of voter disenfranchisement, do you really think that this is the best strategy that the president could have employed?
It's not a question of expanding his base. It's a question of reaching out beyond his base. And if Donald Trump's goal is to remain in power after January 20th of next year, then this is a reasonable strategy. And the reason is this: he can't win a free, fair, and democratic election. It is too late. If he tomorrow started behaving like a rational person who cared about people, it wouldn't matter. It would be too late. I'm not sure he's capable of that. I'm pretty confident he isn't. But this election, as Matt points out so many times, the die is largely already cast. So the question for Trump is, what's the best way to ensure he can stay in power? And to a great extent, the best way to do that is not to try to win an election that if it's level playing field, he can't win, but to ensure that when he begins to execute what, I don't want to say plan because that suggests a level of kind of connected thought that I'm not sure he's capable of, but when he responds to an election defeat by seeking to mobilize, perhaps violently, his supporters, it will matter a lot more that they are rock solid rather than whether he got 44.5 or 43.5% of the vote. So if this were a conventional politician trying to win, in the literal definition of that word, an election, it's a terrible strategy. If it's one aspiring authoritarian who's afraid of being sent, afraid of the long arm of the law, if he loses, then it's a reasonable, rational strategy.
Well, before we get to Joe Biden and his week sitting down with CNN, Lincoln, I want to stay with you, and then Matt, I definitely want to get your thoughts. Lincoln, you've been ringing the alarm about authoritarianism for months now, and it seems as though the president has decided that in response to Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times, in response to her 1619 project, the president has floated this idea of implementing some sort of American educational system, the 1776 project, to teach American school children about the real history of America, essentially literally whitewashing our history and ignoring U.S. chattel slavery and some of the brutality that existed for hundreds of years on American soil, and really presenting an idea of American greatness and exceptionalism that quite honestly is not true. What are your thoughts on how this ties into what you've seen in other regimes, and what do you think the feasibility of this actually getting through Congress or actually becoming something that school children learn in a substantive way from the president, this sort of new indoctrination education?
At every election, we are told this election is about the future. We're told it so much it has no meaning. But in a very real way, this election is about the past. It is about whether we as Americans want to confront the real past, the real truths, the real history, and wrestle with that to try to move forward. This is a very kind of aspirational notion, to move forward to become a better, more democratic country. Or whether we want to hold on very tightly to oversimplifications, perhaps lies about the past because they make us feel good. It's very clear that Donald Trump places himself in the latter category, and many Americans are leaning more towards the former category. But it also, when you think of authoritarian regimes, it is very important for those regimes as they develop to have a narrative about their country's greatness, right? And often it's about our country's greatness that was somehow stolen from us by if you're in the Germany 1930s, by the Jews, right? If you're in Stalin's Soviet Union by the czars and the counter-revolutionaries, right? If you're here in America, it's by the people of color on the left. So telling a story about the past is part of how you construct that authoritarian regime. And that is to a great extent what Donald Trump is trying to do here. And it's falling on very resonant ears because there are a lot of Americans, and they tend to obviously skew older and whiter, who really are not just threatened, but confused and upset when confronted with things like the 1619 Project, which many other Americans, like I would just consider good journalism and good scholarship. But for many, it is very frightening. And Trump is, again, exploiting that fear.
Let me just add to that, though. This conversation always frustrates me because we lay the blame on Donald Trump. This is a feature of the Republican Party. You had the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, come out this week and say, Democrats, by God, can't win back the Senate because they'll give voting power and representation to Black voters in DC and brown voters in Puerto Rico. We have an entire Republican Party that's predicated on the idea that white voters should have a stronger voice in this country and that Black and brown voters should be subjugated to the will of the minority. That is the Republican Party of today. And I know Donald Trump has sort of brought it out all to the surface and talks in a way that's just repugnant, but this is a feature of the Republican Party. And I think we need to come to terms with that, particularly when we think towards governing next year. Assuming Democrats do win back the presidency and do regain Congress, I think we need to have an honest assessment of what sort of legislation needs to happen to ensure that those powers that be that don't want the voices of our people to be heard, frankly, don't have that role in power anymore, because this is a feature of a party that has consistently put down Black and brown voices, African American voters in particular, so that the will of the white minority can hold on to power in this country.
I feel like I've asked you this question before as a Democratic strategist, and this is what worries me. This is what worries me about independents, and this is what worries me about weak-leaning Democrats, and quite honestly, some hardcore Democrats, in the sense that they would never identify themselves as white nationalists, right? They would never say that I think that as a white person, I should have a stronger vote or more of a significant vote than, say, a Black or a Latino or an Asian American. However, there's certain policy issues that do make whites uncomfortable. Maybe it's the 1619 Project. Maybe it's thinking about public education versus charters, right? And homeschooling and sort of education writ large. Maybe it's thinking about housing or reparations or whatever it may be, the policy issue that they do not identify as white nationalists. They would never say that they should have a greater vote, but there's something that makes them very uncomfortable about equity when it comes to other racial groups, and that feels like loss. What are we going to do with those people? Where do you think they're going to be, or how will they behave on November 3rd? Because ideologically, in the macro, sure, they disagree with the Republican Party. But when we start talking about policy in their own lives and pocketbook issues, we see a lot more wiggle room. What's Joe Biden doing to speak directly to those people who honestly can be swayed?
And so I think what we saw this week from the Biden campaign, which I found interesting and heartening, is his ability to take issues which traditionally haven't been issues of racial equality in the national conversation, at least, and bring them into that realm. And sort of the case in point this week was climate change. You saw Donald Trump out in California this week, essentially suggesting under his presidency, he would bring the global temperature down and it would get colder in the world, and climate change would not only just go away, but it would cease to exist. It's nonsense. You had Biden on the flip side give a pretty heart-in speech about the impact of climate change, not just on America, but in particular on communities of color that have been just decimated by climate change over the last few years, and really bring that to the forefront in terms of, hurricanes literally wiping out communities of color along the Gulf Coast, or floods literally wiping out communities in the Midwest, or wildfires wiping out communities in California, and brought issues that I don't traditionally think we've looked at through the lens of equality and fairness in our system into that realm. So I think moving forward, that's really where this conversation needs to go, because I think, to your point, there's a lot of issues: education, climate change, healthcare. You cannot look at any of those issues without looking at the racial disparities that exist in our system. And I think, hopefully, the Biden campaign has put a team together that will start looking at those issues in that dimensional way and creating an agenda that really reflects that.
I mean, Lincoln, what are your thoughts? I mean, because the thing is, oftentimes when we think about Republican voters, we think, as you said, older and whiter. But as we've seen, with some of the new leadership in Congress, but also voters across the country, we're seeing the Republicans are doing a very good job recruiting younger white Americans to feel aggrieved, to feel as though the movement for Black lives is taking something away from them. Immigrants are taking something away from them. So how does the Biden camp not only speak to communities of color, but also, many white Americans who can be swayed by this Republican rhetoric?
Well, with specific regard to the election, it's kind of an interesting moment, because the data is showing that white voters are voting for Biden in higher numbers than they voted for Hillary Clinton or Obama. It's actually voters of color who are Biden's having a harder time with. And I mean, as unusual as this election is it is in some respects a normal American election. There is a number, I'm going to, off the top of my head, around 38, 39%, maybe even a little lower, of the white vote percentage-wise. If Biden gets that, he wins, just like if Obama got it, if Clinton got it. And some Democrats can get it, some can't. But to go back to the 1619 Project, this also, I think the reason that this has potency from where Trump is not just because some people don't, like a lot of white people don't want to discuss slavery. It's because the 1776 framework hits very hard on this idea of American exceptionalism. America, as to use Ronald Reagan's words, the shining city on a hill, right? But that notion of America has a broad bipartisan consensus. And I will give you just one brief example. It was Madeleine Albright, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, who referred to the United States as the indispensable nation, right? Note the definitive article in that, right? If you say the United States is an indispensable nation, well, sure, so are a lot of other people, right? But if you say it is saying that the rest of the world is dispensable, which of course is not true and is deeply offensive if you're, I don't know, anywhere else in the world, right? And that line, until very recently, was celebrated in foreign policy circles among internationalists, including people like Joe Biden, as a statement of America's role. So to move America away from this notion that we're special, we do everything best, in my view is critically important, because then we can begin to learn from other countries that do all these things better than we do, like K through 12 education, like healthcare, like running their elections. And that is also a key thing that Trump—
like transportation.
Like transportation, we go on and on, like infrastructure, right? And that's something also that Trump and the Republicans want to stop, because one thing we do better than many, many countries is create a tax system that does nothing for lower income people and gives a lot of money to rich people. And the Republicans like that idea a lot.
So we've talked about kind of the different strategies between Trump shoring up his base, not really reaching out, Biden still struggling with African-American voters, whether it's his running mate, whether it's his age, whether there's fatigue. He's not Obama, and he's working on it, and he still has a few weeks to go. But the new sort of interesting character in this narrative are Latino voters, Latinx voters, especially in the state of Florida. And as both of you have discussed in previous episodes, we know that for Biden to win this thing, he must have Florida. But Donald Trump is doing some really interesting things with communism and Cuban Americans in Southern Florida especially. And it seems as though even the immigration issue, we know that many Latino voters, especially in places like Arizona and New Mexico, are not pro-immigration. And so Donald Trump has been able to make some inroads with those groups there. So Matt, as a strategist, what can be done for the Democrats to shore up the Latino vote, not just in Florida, but to get those voters really involved and excited about November 3rd?
So there's two things going on here. One is, part of the reason we're having this conversation is there's been a lot of national press over the last few weeks about Biden's support among Latino voters, particularly in Florida, with some recent polling that's come out showing either a closer race than people anticipated or Biden just not doing as well as Hillary Clinton among Latino voters in Florida. Part of that is just, to be perfectly candid, polling among Latino voters is notoriously bad when you look at public polling. There's just a lot of public polling that doesn't include Spanish language interviews, and so you're just not getting a representative look at that community. So that's part of it. It's just we have a bad understanding of what's happening in the Latino community, especially in Florida right now. But I think there is something to be said about just generally Democrats' outreach to the Latino community. And I think what we're seeing in this election is, to be perfectly frank, Donald Trump is, slowly inching up Republican support among Latino voters, in part because of what you've said, his message around the economy, his message about just individual prosperity and opportunity resonates among that community. We know that. And so I think Democrats need to, beyond this election, I don't know sort of how much it actually affects the outcome in November, but regardless, I think Democrats do need to step back after this election cycle and figure out how we can better communicate to what is a very diverse Latino community. You've got Puerto Ricans, you've got Cuban Americans in Florida in particular, and figure out how we can really speak about the economy in a way that relates to those types of voters. Because I do have some concerns that right now, look, Biden's doing really well. He's on track to win the election. The economic message is still a little all over the place. It's, tax the rich and therefore we can, get all these great things, which is, I think, what a lot of white, affluent progressives want to hear. but it's just not necessarily a message that really resonates with people who are working day in and day out to raise and elevate their family into the middle class. And I do think we as Democrats need to do some work moving forward to figure out how to communicate what could be a cohesive message to a much broader and diverse population.
I agree. And Lincoln, picking up on some of Matt's points, I mean, let's be honest, we only have a few weeks left together. Is some of this reticence of Latino support for Biden, are they feeling as though Biden has gone too far into support for, say, Black issues? And is this a way for Latinos to exert some sort of, policy prowess into the narrative?
As a white Jewish guy, I'm a little hesitant to say how, 10, 20 million, 30 million Latinos think and feel. So I'm going to stay away from that a little bit.
I appreciate the honesty, Lincoln.
Well, and who doesn't speak Spanish? I mean, I don't know that I'm the right guy to ask the question. I could recommend somebody, but I'm going to look more at the campaigns, right? What we saw in the primary was that Biden went very aggressively after the African-American vote, particularly, but not only in South Carolina, and that's why he's the nominee. But Bernie Sanders, the biggest thing he did differently this year from last time is he went very hard after the Latino vote. And the Latino vote, we talked a lot about Florida, but I'd like to raise two states and perhaps a third, Arizona and Nevada, which should be blue and where Trump is making a run. And the Latino vote there is a different demographic than in Florida. And that's where what I would, and you could even throw Texas in there. If you want to play in Texas,
yeah.
You can't do it without Latinos. In those three states, we're talking primarily Mexican Americans. And these are not people who you can red bait to the Republican Party. They don't care about Castro so much, right?
No.
These are often folks who are very progressive. That's why they went with Bernie. There's a strong labor union tradition. The reason Nevada is trending blue is because of organized labor in Nevada, which is heavily Latino in terms of the membership. So what I would say is work those votes hard to make sure you carry those states and use some and bring Bernie, who has been, I think, very good, but perhaps underused here. Redeploy Bernie to work in those Latino communities with some of the Latino relationships he built during the campaign. Whether you're particularly, I think when you're talking about Latino votes, African American votes, you don't get those votes if you don't work those communities. So there is time to do that. It can be done, but there's no time like today to begin starting because it's got to happen.
Now, Matt, as a strategist, though, picking up on what Lincoln just said, I definitely think that Bernie Sanders could and should do more. I think he should have done more in 2016 as well to assist Hillary Clinton. Whether personally he wants to or he's asked, we don't know that conversation just yet. But if Lincoln is correct in his assessment that we should deploy Bernie Sanders to places like Arizona, Nevada, Texas, does that then give the Trump campaign fodder to say, because we know they've been all over the place. One day they're saying that Biden, Harris are leftist, socialist, communists, all the ists, right? The next day they're saying that they're police and 94 crime bill and truancy policies when Harris was AG. They're not too sure whether or not they should try and say that the Biden-Harris camp is too conservative to be Democrats or too progressive to be Democrats. By deploying Bernie Sanders in those three states that Lincoln mentioned, does that then solidify at least one angle of a Trump attack, saying that if Biden and Harris are elected, we will have a Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez administration that everyone should fear?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's why you haven't seen it. I mean, it sounds trite for me to keep saying, but this election will be determined based on Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the single figure that's driving voter intent in this election. And so it's not to say that Joe Biden can't do anything to affect the outcome of this election, but it's being driven by what Donald Trump does in his day-to-day. And I think what you've seen because of that is a real difficulty from Trump and his campaign to paint a picture of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They tried painting them as, the socialist, uber progressives, and that didn't really work. They tried to paint a picture of them, too tough on the police, which didn't really work. Too close to China, which didn't really work. They're trying to run this campaign about, Joe Biden is too weak and ineffective to be president. And then Joe Biden goes on TV and puts up a great performance at a town hall, which makes everyone think, what is the Trump campaign talking about? they haven't really landed a message. And so it's obvious that the Biden campaign is in part holding back their arsenal of supporters like Bernie Sanders to avoid those types of critiques and keep the focus on Donald Trump, which admittedly is working. I mean, we keep having this conversation every week of, can Trump turn the tide? Can he improve upon his dismal numbers? Can he win over swing voters? And every week we keep having this conversation and he's incapable of doing it. And at this point, voters are already voting. Early voting has already been taking place for a week or so in North Carolina. Over 100,000 voters have voted there. In-person early voting has started in places like Virginia and Minnesota, where there's record turnout for in-person early voting. And so the people are voting. And so at some point, we need to come to terms with the reality that Donald Trump is just not trying to win the popular vote in this election and needs some sort of game changer to really stem the tide of what we're seeing in front of our eyes.
Right. And that's what worries me, because maybe I just don't trust, A, people going to the polls, and B, I guess I don't trust the people who are counting ballots in certain states and certain counties. But I'm just going to have to go on faith, I guess, for this particular election. I mean, Lincoln, in the last 2 minutes that we have, Matt's sort of laid out the Trump strategy. So for the next few weeks with Joe Biden, is it just let Donald Trump be himself?
Well, you can't stop Donald Trump from being Trump. So that's
right. But so what should Biden do in these last, we've got less than 6 weeks now?
Biden is running an odd campaign because the pundits don't love it, but the voters seem to like it a lot, right? And actually, there are more votes among voters than among pundits. So on balance, that's probably a wise strategy. So while I can be critical, I think I have to recognize he's held a lead since March, and Trump and an incumbent president can't change that. That is a strong campaign. So to a great extent, Biden should keep doing what he's doing. The debate is going to be an interesting moment because Trump will be ill-prepared unprepared, because he's always unprepared. So Biden, they've set the bar so low for Biden, but the one thing that comes to mind is I think Biden needs to make sure to keep his cool, because Trump gets him so crazy in the same way he gets many Americans so crazy. People don't want to see that in the president. So that comes to mind as we look towards the debate. He needs to keep his cool, but basically he needs to keep doing what he's doing, and the campaign needs to make sure, to speak to your last point, that voters in all the different states know exactly how they vote, where they vote, what voting looks like there, whether it's better to vote early, where that place is, what mail-in voting looks like, whether you need a witness or not. The mechanics of this election raise a lot of work that has to be done for Biden.
So it's not just about voting, but it's the mechanics of the voting and making sure we understand the policies and the rules as to how we can get our votes counted. Thank you both so much. So that's all the time we have. You've been watching the election show on MNN. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. Thanks again.